The airport was already alive before sunrise. The sound of rolling suitcases, the buzz of conversations, and the echo of boarding announcements filled the air. It was one of those mornings where everyone seemed to be in a rush, trying to reach their gates before the final call. Among the long lines of travelers stood a man in a tailored gray suit. He held his passport and ticket in one hand and his phone in the other, talking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear about his business meeting in New York. He gave off the air of someone important, someone who believed the world should move aside when he walked by. His polished shoes, designer watch, and confident stride told anyone watching that he wasn't used to waiting for things. When the boarding for first class was announced, he was the first to move, cutting slightly ahead of an elderly couple without so much as an apology. The flight attendant at the gate scanned his ticket, greeted him politely, and he gave her a nod that barely passed for acknowledgement. Just a few steps behind him was a woman who looked far less hurried. She carried a small black backpack and a neatly folded jacket in her arms. Her outfit was simple, jeans and a plain shirt, nothing that stood out among the travelers. She smiled softly at the attendant, thanked her, and walked calmly toward the plane. There was something peaceful about the way she moved, quiet and composed, as though she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Inside the first-class cabin, the man placed his bag in the overhead compartment and settled into his seat with a satisfied sigh. The large leather chair, the wide screen, the glass of juice offered before takeoff. Everything was just as he expected. First class was his territory. It was where people like him belonged. But when the same woman from the line entered the cabin and walked down the aisle, his expression changed slightly. He watched as she checked her ticket and then stopped right beside his row. The woman smiled politely and placed her things in the overhead compartment across from him. She then took the seat beside the window, directly next to him. The man blinked, confused. He looked her up and down, his mind already forming a judgment. Her simple clothes, her calm demeanor, her lack of luxury luggage, none of it fit what he thought belonged in first class. He glanced around, waiting for someone, maybe a flight attendant, to notice the mistake, but no one did. The woman adjusted her seatbelt, thanked the attendant for the welcome drink, and began to look out the window. The man leaned slightly toward her, his tone sharp but coated with forced politeness. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you sure you're in the right section? This is first class." She turned to him, her expression kind but firm. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm in the right seat." He frowned as if he hadn't heard her right. "You're sure? Because sometimes they mix up seat numbers. I've seen it happen. You might want to double-check before they make you move back." The woman smiled again, still calm. "I appreciate your concern, but this is my seat." Her voice carried no irritation, just quiet confidence. But for the man, that only made him more uneasy. He didn't respond, only gave a tight nod and turned away, muttering something under his breath. A few minutes later, one of the flight attendants came by to offer hot towels. The man seized the opportunity. "Excuse me," he said quickly. "I think there's been a mistake. This woman here might have been seated incorrectly. I'm not sure she's supposed to be in first class." The flight attendant blinked, surprised by his comment. "Sir, may I see your boarding passes?" He handed his over proudly as though it would prove something. The woman handed hers too quietly, without a hint of concern. The attendant looked at both tickets, then smiled politely. "Both of you are in the correct seats," she said. "If there's anything else I can help you with, please let me know." The man's jaw tightened. "No, that's fine," he said through clenched teeth. He gave a stiff smile and leaned back in his seat, but his expression made it clear he wasn't satisfied with the answer. The woman simply thanked the attendant and went back to looking out the window. The plane continued boarding. Passengers filled the economy section behind them, and soon the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew prepared for takeoff. The man pulled out his phone again, pretending to scroll through emails, though his mind was still stuck on the woman beside him. He couldn't stop thinking about how out of place she looked. In his mind, first class was for people who had earned it, people like him, not for someone who looked so ordinary. But while he silently judged her, she sat quietly watching the ground crew move outside, lost in her own thoughts. Every now and then she took a deep breath, her calmness contrasting sharply with his restless energy. As the engines roared to life, the flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking seatbelts and securing trays. The man caught the attention of one of them again. "Could you tell me who's piloting this flight?" he asked, his tone casual but proud. "I like to know who's flying me before I take off." The attendant smiled politely. "Our captain is one of the best," she said. "You're in good hands." "Good," the man replied, leaning back. "Hope it's someone experienced. I fly a lot, and I can usually tell if the cockpit's got a steady hand." The woman turned her head slightly at his words but said nothing. She only smiled faintly, almost as if she knew something he didn't. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and the man's attention shifted back to his screen. He started watching a business documentary, though he barely paid attention. His thoughts still wandered to the woman sitting next to him. Who was she? Why was she there? Maybe she'd been upgraded by accident, he thought. Maybe she had some friend at the airline. It didn't matter. He still didn't like it. As the plane lifted off the ground, she closed her eyes for a moment as if listening closely to the rhythm of the engines. It wasn't the casual curiosity of a passenger. It was the focused awareness of someone who understood every sound, every vibration. But the man didn't notice. He was too busy sipping his drink and mentally listing the things he'd complain about later. The boarding process, the coffee, the passengers who didn't fit. When the seatbelt sign went off, the woman opened her eyes again and smiled slightly. She reached into her backpack and took out a small notebook, flipping through pages filled with neat handwriting. From time to time, she jotted something down, small notes that only she seemed to understand. The man glanced at it curiously, trying to peek without seeming obvious. "What do you do?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. She looked at him, surprised by the question. "I work for the airline," she said. His eyes widened a little. "Oh, really? So that's how you got this seat. Must be nice to have connections." She just smiled, not confirming or denying. "Something like that," she said gently. Her calmness seemed to irritate him even more. There was something about her that didn't fit the picture he had drawn in his head. And the more he tried to understand her, the less sense it made. As the flight continued, the cabin lights dimmed further, and most passengers settled in. The man ordered another drink, scrolled through his emails again, and glanced at his watch. Meanwhile, the woman looked completely at peace, as if she belonged there all along. The irony was lost on him for now. He had no idea that the woman he thought didn't belong in first class was not just a passenger. She wasn't upgraded by mistake. She wasn't lucky or connected. She was there because she earned it, in more ways than he could imagine, and soon he was going to find out exactly who she was. The plane had been in the air for about half an hour. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, soft and steady, almost like a low song in the background. The first-class section was quiet except for the occasional sound of glasses clinking or pages turning. The man in the gray suit had already finished his drink and now scrolled through his tablet, trying to look busy. Every now and then his eyes flicked toward the woman sitting beside him. She was reading something on her phone, calm as ever, not even noticing his restless glances. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Something about the whole situation bothered him. He had paid a large sum of money for this seat, as he always did when he traveled. He worked hard, he told himself, and he deserved comfort. But this woman sitting there in simple clothes seemed out of place to him. It just didn't make sense. He wondered again if she'd somehow gotten upgraded, or if she worked for someone important. He sighed loudly, hoping she might take the hint and say something, but she didn't. She just smiled faintly and kept to herself. That quietness made him even more irritated. A flight attendant came by to serve the meal, her polite smile never fading even as she moved through the narrow aisles. "Would you like the chicken or the pasta, sir?" she asked. "The chicken," he said quickly, and then gestured toward the woman beside him. "You might want to check her ticket again. Just making sure she actually ordered for this section." The attendant paused for a second, confused, but kept her tone polite. "She's on the list, sir." "She's fine." The woman beside him gave a small smile, one that wasn't mocking or defensive, just patient. She accepted her meal and quietly thanked the attendant. The man leaned back in his seat, shaking his head slightly. "You'd think they'd keep some standards," he muttered, not loud enough for everyone to hear, but just enough for her to catch the words. She didn't react. She simply continued eating, taking small bites, her focus on the meal, not on him. Her calmness only made his frustration worse. He was the type who liked to be noticed. He wanted acknowledgement, to feel important. But the woman beside him didn't give him that satisfaction. She didn't treat him like someone who needed to be impressed. She was just polite. And that, in his world, felt like being ignored. After the meal, the attendants cleared the trays. The lights dimmed a little as most passengers began to relax. The man pressed the call button for the attendant again. "Yes, sir," she said, approaching. "Can you please check again if this lady's supposed to be here? I'm sorry, but it's just strange. I fly first class all the time, and I've never seen anyone so casual. I don't mean to sound rude, but it's uncomfortable." The woman looked down, taking a quiet breath, but still didn't speak. The flight attendant, however, looked slightly uncomfortable now. "Sir," she said softly, "her ticket is valid. She's supposed to be here. Everyone in this cabin is in their proper seat." "Well," he said, crossing his arms, "then maybe you should have a better dress code for first class. People expect a certain kind of environment, you know." The attendant nodded politely, though her eyes said otherwise. "I understand, sir. Is there anything else I can bring you?" "No," he said shortly, waving her away. When she left, he turned to the woman again. "I hope you don't take this the wrong way," he began, trying to sound polite. "But you have to admit you don't really fit the part here. I mean, most people who sit in first class look like they belong. You look more like a traveler from economy, don't you think?" The woman turned to face him, her calm eyes steady. "Do you think people who fly first class all look the same?" she asked gently. He blinked, caught off guard. "Well, not exactly, but you know what I mean." She smiled faintly. "No, I don't think I do." Her voice was soft, but there was something powerful in the way she said it. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sarcasm, it was quiet confidence. That confidence made him fall silent for a few seconds. He took a sip of his drink, unsure how to respond. He didn't like feeling wrong. And he didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. After a moment, he said, "You must travel a lot too then, huh?" "For work?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, quite a lot. What kind of work?" he asked, curiosity and condescension mixing in his tone. "I work in aviation," she said simply. His eyebrows rose. "Oh, so you're with the airline then? That makes sense now. They probably upgraded you because you work here." He gave a smug smile. "Lucky you," her eyes softened. "Something like that," she said again, her tone neutral. He chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "You must have friends in the right places. I mean, I've been flying for years and never get a free upgrade." The woman turned back toward the window, ending the conversation politely without saying another word. The man didn't notice the way one of the flight attendants glanced at her with quiet respect as she walked by. He didn't see the subtle nod the woman gave back, the kind of nod exchanged between colleagues who share an unspoken understanding. To him, she was still just someone who didn't belong there. Hours passed, and the plane began flying through light turbulence. The seatbelt signs came on and passengers were asked to remain seated. The cabin lights flickered softly as the plane rocked slightly in the wind. The man gripped his armrest tightly, his expression changing from pride to mild worry. "They'd better have someone good flying this thing," he muttered. The woman beside him didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, she looked even calmer than before. She kept her eyes forward, listening closely to the sounds of the engines and the rhythm of the flight. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, not nervously, but in a measured, almost professional way. When the turbulence settled, she leaned back, still peaceful. The man let out a breath of relief. "I told you," he said, half laughing. "I can always tell when the pilots know what they're doing. Smooth recovery. These guys must be top of their game." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes glancing toward the cockpit door for a brief second. "Yes," she said softly. "They are." Her words carried a quiet amusement that he didn't understand. A few minutes later, one of the attendants approached the woman and whispered something to her. She nodded, then reached up to retrieve her small black jacket from the overhead bin. As she stood up, the man looked at her, confused. "Where are you going?" "We're in the air," he said. She smiled kindly. "Just need to speak to someone for a moment," she replied. The attendant led her toward the front of the cabin, closer to the cockpit door. The man watched, curiosity etched across his face. He saw the attendant press a small button near the door, saw the woman exchange a quiet word, and then saw the door open just enough for her to step inside. He frowned. "Wait a minute," he whispered to himself. "Why would they let her in there?" For the next few minutes, she didn't return. The man sat upright now, his earlier smugness replaced by confusion. He craned his neck, trying to see through the curtain that separated first class from the front section of the plane. Finally, the intercom clicked and a familiar female voice came through. Calm, professional, steady. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet, and the weather ahead looks clear. We'll be arriving slightly earlier than expected. Thank you for flying with us. The man froze. That voice. It was her. He turned to look at the cockpit door again, disbelief washing over his face. Passengers nearby exchanged quiet smiles. The flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. And just a few moments later, the same woman who had been sitting beside him walked back to her seat. She placed her jacket neatly on her lap and gave him a small, polite smile. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time during the entire flight, he didn't know what to say. The arrogance that had filled his voice earlier was gone, replaced with something else, quiet embarrassment. And as the plane continued through the sky, he realized something he hadn't before. The woman he had judged for her clothes, her calmness, and her seat, she wasn't just supposed to be in first class. She was supposed to be flying the plane. The moment passed, but the man in the gray suit couldn't stop staring. The calm, quiet woman beside him, the one he had judged, whispered about, and tried to undermine, had just spoken to the passengers as the captain of the flight. Her voice over the intercom had been steady, clear, and completely professional. Every word she spoke carried authority, yet there was warmth in it, a gentle confidence that instantly put people at ease. He tried to act casual, but he felt a heat rising to his face. The other passengers noticed his discomfort, and a few of them glanced at him with quiet amusement. He shifted in his seat, crossing his arms tightly as if trying to shield himself from the realization slowly settling in. This woman, the one he had decided didn't belong in first class, was not only qualified to be here, she was in control of the aircraft. For a while, silence filled the cabin. The only sounds were the soft hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of magazines. The woman, now sitting back in her seat, opened her small notebook again and began jotting down a few notes. Her posture was relaxed but precise, every movement calm and deliberate. She gave the impression of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, someone who had complete control of her world even at 35,000 feet above the ground. The man swallowed hard and tried to redirect his thoughts. He picked up his tablet again and scrolled through emails, but he couldn't focus. Every time he glanced at her, his mind kept replaying the intercom announcement, her calm expression, and that quiet, commanding presence. He had assumed she was just another passenger, maybe someone lucky or connected. But now he had to confront a humbling truth. He had been completely wrong. A few passengers around him whispered to each other, some smiling quietly. One woman leaned over to her companion and said, "I didn't know she was the captain until the announcement. Can you believe it?" Others nodded and some laughed softly, shaking their heads in disbelief. The story was unfolding right in front of them, and the man realized that everyone now knew more about her than he did. He wanted to say something, to speak up, but no words came out. For the first time in a long time, he felt small, embarrassed, and out of place in a situation he had thought he controlled. He had acted as if first class was a place only for people like him, a place where appearances mattered more than skill or experience. And now, sitting next to someone who had far more authority than he could imagine, he understood how wrong he had been. Minutes passed, and the woman remained composed, flipping through her notebook occasionally, looking out the window occasionally and always calm. He kept stealing glances at her, trying to understand how someone could be so composed, so confident, so unbothered by his arrogance. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. I didn't realize. She looked at him, not with anger or judgment, but with a patient curiosity. Didn't realize what? She asked gently. He hesitated, searching for the right words, but none came easily. He felt exposed, as if his previous behavior had been laid bare for everyone to see. That, you're the captain, he finally muttered. She nodded slightly, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips. Yes, she said. I am. The man swallowed hard. He couldn't believe he had been so quick to judge her based on what she wore, how she spoke, and the way she carried herself. All of his assumptions, all of his arrogance had been completely misplaced. She didn't say anything more. She returned her attention to her notebook, her movements calm and deliberate, not seeking any recognition for what had just happened. That humility, combined with her authority, made him feel even smaller. He had assumed that first-class passengers were people who should be respected for their wealth, their style, or their appearance, but she commanded respect in a way he had never encountered before. The flight continued, smooth and uneventful, but the man's thoughts were anything but. He tried to focus on the view outside, the clouds rolling by in soft waves, but his mind kept returning to the woman beside him. He thought about his own behavior earlier, the demands, the judgment, the unnecessary confrontation with the flight attendant. Every word, every action now seemed childish and petty. He had let his ego take control, and the reality had humbled him in a single moment. Passengers around him were beginning to relax. Some were reading, some were talking quietly, and some were even taking photos of the clouds outside. But the man could hardly relax. The revelation had unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. The woman had taught him, without saying a word, a lesson about humility, respect, and the danger of judging someone by appearances. A flight attendant came by to check on him, offering water. He accepted, nodding silently. She glanced toward the woman, who was still seated, calm and composed, and smiled politely. The man noticed the exchange, subtle as it was, and realized that even the crew recognized her authority and professionalism. For the rest of the flight, he couldn't bring himself to speak much. He tried a few casual comments about the weather or the scenery outside, but the woman responded politely and briefly, not making him feel foolish, but not indulging his earlier arrogance either. Every interaction reminded him that appearances and assumptions could be completely wrong. He found himself replaying the incident in his mind, thinking about how quickly he had judged her, how confident he had been that he was right, and how completely wrong he had been. It was a humbling experience, one that made him reflect not only on this flight but on how he treated people in general. How often had he assumed someone's place, their abilities, or their worth based on appearances alone? The woman, meanwhile, remained the same calm presence she had been since boarding. She didn't gloat, she didn't remind anyone of her authority, and she didn't let the arrogance around her affect her. She simply existed in her role, competent, confident, and quiet. The man noticed something else, too. While she didn't speak much, her presence seemed to command the respect of everyone in the cabin. Other passengers smiled at her when she passed, some whispered quietly to each other, and the flight attendants moved with extra care, acknowledging her without needing words. It was a quiet authority, not loud or demanding but deeply felt. He realized that all his assumptions had been based on superficial things, clothes, demeanor, and a quick judgment of character. And now he felt ashamed. He thought about how he had demanded she leave first class, how he had whispered complaints, and how he had acted entitled. Every memory made his stomach twist. He had assumed superiority where there was none and had been utterly wrong. Time passed and the flight began its descent. The woman made her way to the front of the cabin briefly, likely checking on the final preparations with the crew. The man watched, still in disbelief, as she moved with a quiet authority that no one could question. The realization that he had underestimated her completely weighed on him heavily. By the time the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the man felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. He had experienced a humbling lesson, one that he knew he would not forget. The woman beside him remained calm, her focus entirely on her responsibilities, completely unaware of the inner turmoil she had caused in one arrogant passenger. As the passengers disembarked, the man followed quietly, hesitant, unsure if he should say something. He didn't want to intrude or appear foolish, but he also wanted to acknowledge the lesson he had just learned. She was already walking toward the cockpit to finalize her duties, calm and professional as ever. He took a deep breath and finally spoke, just as she was about to step aside. I'm sorry, he said quietly. She turned to him, her expression gentle but not patronizing. Apology accepted, she said softly. That brief exchange said more than he could have imagined. She hadn't needed to embarrass him to prove herself or to assert authority. She simply lived it quietly, and that was enough. He walked out of the plane feeling different than when he had boarded. He felt humbled, more aware of his assumptions, and strangely grateful for the experience. He had encountered someone who had completely challenged his sense of entitlement, and in doing so, had taught him a lesson about humility, respect, and the true measure of a person. For the first time, he realized that respect wasn't about the seat you sit in, the clothes you wear, or the wealth you display. Respect was earned through action, through calmness, through quiet competence, and through the ability to command authority without arrogance. And in that quiet, fleeting moment on a plane high above the ground, he understood it in a way he would never forget. The plane was now descending, and the city lights of New York began to appear through the windows in soft glimmers. Stretching across the horizon like a carpet of stars on the ground, the passengers in first class were settling back into their seats, gathering belongings and preparing for landing. There was a quiet sense of anticipation, the gentle hum of conversation mingling with the occasional rustle of bags and coats. The man in the gray suit sat back in his seat, still feeling a mix of embarrassment and awe. He hadn't spoken much since the apology exchange with the woman. In fact, he hadn't even looked directly at her. Unsure how to address someone he had underestimated so completely, he felt small, humbled, and slightly ashamed, realizing how quick he had been to judge someone simply by appearances. The woman, sitting beside the window, had removed her jacket and folded it neatly on her lap. She flipped through her notebook one last time, making a few notes, but otherwise remained composed and calm. Her presence in the cabin was quiet, unassuming, yet it radiated authority. Every passenger who glanced at her seemed to sense it, though they didn't yet fully understand why. A few minutes later, the lead flight attendant approached her seat. "Captain, may I speak with you for a moment before landing?" she asked quietly. She nodded and stood gracefully, collecting her notebook and jacket. The man watched her, confused, as she followed the attendant toward the front of the cabin. She passed the other passengers politely, offering a small nod or smile to those who looked her way. Some passengers whispered to each other, clearly curious about her calm and professional demeanor. The man's curiosity grew stronger with every step she took. He still didn't fully understand her role, though he suspected she was more than just a passenger. When she reached the front of the cabin, the cockpit door opened slightly, and she slipped inside with a soft click of the latch. The man's heart began to race. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together the reality he had only glimpsed moments ago. She had spoken over the intercom as the captain. She had commanded the flight, kept everyone calm, and now she was actually heading to the cockpit to handle the final stages of landing. The man leaned forward, trying to get a better view without being obvious. He could see her through the small window in the cockpit door. She moved with purpose, checking instruments, speaking softly to the co-pilot, and adjusting controls. Every movement was precise, deliberate, and calm. There was no hesitation, no doubt. She was fully in command, and it was clear that the crew around her respected her completely. The other passengers noticed it too. Some whispered softly, "She's amazing," while others just stared in quiet admiration. The man felt a strange mixture of emotions, awe, embarrassment, and a deep respect he hadn't expected to feel. For the first time, he realized that true authority didn't need to be loud or boastful. It could be quiet, calm, and confident, and still command absolute respect. As the plane began its final descent, the woman remained in the cockpit, focused and professional. The city lights grew brighter, and the sounds of the engines shifted subtly as the aircraft adjusted altitude. The man's mind wandered back to the way he had treated her earlier, demanding that she leave first class, whispering complaints to the flight attendant, judging her for her appearance. Every memory made him cringe. He had let pride and arrogance cloud his judgment, and he now understood the lesson he had been taught in a most unexpected way. After a few tense minutes, the cockpit door opened again. She stepped out gracefully, returning to her seat in first class. Her calm smile and composed demeanor were unchanged, as if nothing had happened. The man stared at her, still trying to process everything. She walked past him and nodded politely, and he felt a shiver of humility pass through him. He had underestimated her completely. Other passengers were beginning to realize what had happened. They had seen her in the cockpit, handling the plane, and some began quietly discussing it amongst themselves. "Did you see that? She was the captain," one whispered. "All this time she just sat there like a regular passenger." The woman returned to her seat, collecting her notebook and jacket. She looked around the cabin briefly, giving a nod to the flight attendants who smiled back at her with subtle respect. The man in the gray suit finally mustered the courage to speak, though his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I didn't realize you were actually the captain." She looked at him, her calm eyes steady, and said softly, "Yes, I am." The man swallowed hard. He had nothing more to say. His arrogance, his assumptions, and his sense of superiority had been completely dismantled in the span of a few hours. He felt humbled, not just by her authority but by the quiet way she carried herself. She hadn't needed to prove anything. Her competence, professionalism, and calmness had spoken for themselves. The rest of the flight passed quietly. The man couldn't focus on anything else. He kept glancing at the woman beside him, thinking about how he had judged her, how wrong he had been, and how much he had learned in such a short time. The other passengers seemed aware of the story unfolding in front of them, though no one said much. There was a collective sense of respect and admiration for her calm authority. When the plane finally touched down on the runway, it was smooth, precise, and perfect. The passengers applauded softly, not just for the landing, but for the skill and composure of the woman who had quietly controlled everything. The man in the gray suit felt a pang of embarrassment. He had assumed superiority based on appearances, yet here he was, humbled by someone he had dismissed so quickly. As the plane taxied to the gate, the woman remained composed, gathering her belongings and preparing to disembark. She stood, straightened her jacket, and smiled politely at the passengers around her. The man watched her, still unable to fully process the situation. He realized that his assumptions had been childish, driven by ego and superficial judgment. She had taught him a lesson without even trying, a lesson in humility, respect, and the danger of judging people too quickly. Passengers began to stand, collecting their bags and stretching after the long flight. The man hesitated, unsure if he should say anything more. Finally, he approached her as she reached the aisle. "I just want to say, I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice filled with genuine humility. She turned to him, her expression calm and kind. "Apology accepted," she replied softly. Her words were gentle, yet they carried a quiet strength that reinforced the lesson he had learned. As he walked toward the exit, he reflected on the experience. The flight had been more than just a journey from one city to another. It had been a journey of self-awareness, a lesson in humility, and a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. He had assumed that first-class passengers were entitled, that appearances and wealth mattered more than skill and character. He had been wrong. The woman, meanwhile, quietly moved toward the cockpit to finalize her duties. She didn't need recognition or applause. Her authority, her competence, and her calm demeanor were enough to command respect. She had shown, without arrogance or confrontation, that true skill and confidence were far more powerful than any seat, any outfit, or any title. As passengers filed off the plane, the man lingered for a moment, watching her from a distance. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lesson he had been given. He had come on the flight confident, entitled, and judgmental. He left humbled, aware, and respectful, forever changed by the quiet authority of a woman who had commanded a plane with skill, grace, and humility. Other passengers whispered quietly to each other as they exited, sharing their amazement and admiration. The story of the woman who had quietly commanded the flight, sitting seemingly like any other passenger, was spreading quickly in their conversations. And the man in the gray suit, once arrogant and judgmental, silently acknowledged that he had learned one of the most valuable lessons of his life, that respect is earned, humility matters, and true strength is quiet, steady, and unwavering. Even as they walked through the airport terminal, the man reflected on the moments that had changed him. He realized that arrogance and judgment only limit a person, while calm confidence and competence inspire admiration and trust. He had been confronted with the truth in the most unexpected way, and he knew he would never forget the lesson the woman had taught him on that flight. The city lights outside the terminal seemed brighter now, more vivid as he stepped into the flow of travelers. His perspective had shifted. He understood in a way he never had before, that appearances could be misleading, that authority could be quiet and unassuming, and that humility and professionalism were far more powerful than wealth, style, or entitlement. And for the first time in his life, he felt a profound respect for someone who had quietly shown him what true confidence and leadership looked like. The plane had finally reached the gate, and the passengers began to stand, collecting their belongings and preparing to leave. There was a quiet excitement in the cabin, a mix of relief and admiration. Some passengers whispered to each other, still replaying the moment when the calm, modest woman had spoken over the intercom as the captain. For many, it was a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that true authority was measured not by clothes or title, but by skill, confidence, and calmness under pressure. The man in the gray suit remained seated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He felt a strange combination of relief, embarrassment, and awe. Every step of the flight had been a lesson he hadn't expected to receive, and now, as he watched the passengers file past him, he understood how much he had misjudged the woman beside him. He had assumed she was just a passenger, someone who didn't belong in first class, someone he could quietly criticize without consequence. But she had quietly, calmly, and confidently taught him a lesson he would never forget. As he stood and grabbed his briefcase, he watched her move toward the cockpit. She carried herself with the same calm authority she had shown throughout the flight. There was no rush, no unnecessary flourish, just quiet competence. The man hesitated, unsure if he should approach her, but he felt compelled to acknowledge the lesson she had given him. He took a deep breath and moved toward her, his steps slow and deliberate. "Excuse me," he said softly, careful not to sound confrontational or demanding. She turned, her expression calm but attentive. "Yes?" she asked, her voice steady, patient, and gentle. He paused, searching for words that could convey both apology and respect. I want to apologize," he said finally. "For earlier, for how I acted, for what I said, and for judging you based on appearances. I was wrong and I realize it now." She regarded him quietly for a moment, her calm eyes meeting his. Then she smiled, not smugly or triumphantly, but with quiet grace. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means a lot. We all make mistakes. What matters is recognizing them and learning from them." The man nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He realized that this simple exchange, brief as it was, carried a lesson far deeper than anything he had expected to learn on a flight. Humility, respect, and patience. These were qualities he had overlooked, assuming that confidence and entitlement were enough. Now he understood that true authority came from competence and calmness, not arrogance or outward appearance. As the passengers began to disembark, some stopped to offer polite nods or smiles to the woman who had quietly commanded their flight. A few whispered words of admiration or congratulations. The man felt a mixture of humility and gratitude. He had been so quick to judge, so certain of his own superiority, and yet she had shown him, without arrogance or confrontation, the truth of her skill and character. He followed her toward the exit, hesitating again, unsure if he should say anything more. She moved with quiet purpose, collecting her belongings and speaking briefly to the flight attendants who had assisted her. The crew's respect was evident, not through words but through their attentive and polite gestures. The man realized that this was another part of the lesson. Respect earned quietly and consistently carried more weight than any display of wealth, authority, or self-importance. When they reached the terminal, the woman paused, turning to glance at the passengers around her. Her expression was serene, composed, and confident. She gave a small nod to the man, acknowledging him without making a scene, and he felt a mix of relief and admiration. He had been humbled, yes, but he had also learned something valuable, something that would stay with him long after this flight was over. The man took a deep breath and spoke one last time. "I just want to say thank you, not just for accepting my apology, but for showing me something I didn't understand before. I misjudged you completely, and I've learned a lot today." She smiled faintly, a soft warmth in her expression. "I'm glad you understand," she said. "Life often teaches us lessons in unexpected ways. Sometimes it's through people, sometimes through situations, and sometimes through moments we least expect. What matters is that we pay attention and grow from them." The man nodded, feeling a sense of humility and clarity that he had never experienced before. For hours he had allowed arrogance and assumptions to cloud his judgment, but now he realized the value of quiet strength, competence, and humility. He had assumed that first-class passengers deserved respect because of who they appeared to be, and he had been wrong. Respect, he now understood, was about what a person could do, how they carried themselves, and the integrity they demonstrated in every action. Passengers began to move further down the terminal, gathering their luggage, speaking quietly to companions, and heading toward exits or transportation. The man lingered a moment longer, watching the woman continue toward her duties. She didn't flaunt her authority, didn't demand recognition, and didn't seek attention. She simply lived it quietly, and that was enough. As he walked behind her, he noticed other passengers glancing at her with admiration and curiosity. Some were talking quietly among themselves, retelling the story of the flight and her calm, confident command. The man realized that he wasn't the only one who had been impressed, who had been humbled, and who had learned something valuable from her presence. The lesson she had given was universal. Appearances can be deceiving, and true strength and authority come from competence, calmness, and quiet confidence. He reflected on his behavior earlier on the plane, the demands, the complaints, the judgments he had made about someone based purely on how they looked. Each memory made him wince. He had assumed superiority, entitlement, and control where none existed, and he had been completely wrong. Now he understood that humility was not weakness, that patience and calmness were not passive, and that true authority could be quiet yet profoundly impactful. The woman continued down the terminal, speaking briefly with the flight crew and coordinating a few last tasks before leaving. She moved with purpose and grace, her demeanor calm and professional, a silent example of leadership in action. The man followed at a respectful distance, wanting to witness and absorb the lesson fully, without intruding or drawing attention to himself. Finally, she paused at the terminal exit, turning slightly to address the crew one last time. "Thank you for your support today," she said softly. "It's been a smooth flight because of all of you." Her words were simple, but they carried authority, warmth, and genuine respect. The crew responded with nods and smiles, clearly appreciative of her acknowledgement. The man watched, feeling a deep sense of awe. He had been confronted with someone who had completely dismantled his assumptions, challenged his arrogance, and taught him a lesson in humility without ever raising her voice or seeking confrontation. He realized that respect was earned not by entitlement or appearances, but by quiet competence, confidence, and integrity. As he stepped forward to leave the plane, he glanced at her one final time. She caught his eye briefly and gave a small, acknowledging nod. It was enough. No words were needed. The lesson had been taught, the apology accepted, and the impact deeply felt. Outside the terminal, the evening air was crisp and alive with the sounds of the city. People were moving in every direction, taxis and buses waiting, travelers hurrying along. The man paused for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. He had boarded the plane confident, entitled, and judgmental, certain of his own superiority. He left the plane humbled, aware, and deeply respectful, having learned a lesson that would stay with him forever. He thought about how often in life people judged others based on appearances, wealth, clothing, or demeanor. How many times had he himself done it before, assuming he knew someone's worth or character without really knowing them? The flight had shown him that true authority, respect, and competence were far more powerful than any superficial measure. He had been reminded that humility, patience, and quiet confidence were qualities worth cultivating, and that they often spoke louder than arrogance or entitlement ever could. The story of the flight, of the calm, composed woman who had quietly commanded the plane while sitting beside a man who had judged her unfairly, spread quickly among passengers as they left the terminal. Some shared it with friends and family, others posted it online, and some simply carried the lesson with them personally. The man in the gray suit knew that he would never forget it. Even now, as he walked through the terminal toward the exit, he felt a shift in his perspective. He understood more deeply than ever the value of humility, the importance of competence, and the power of quiet authority. He realized that respect should never be assumed or demanded. It must be earned, and it is often shown through actions, patience, and skill rather than appearance or entitlement. The woman continued on her way, her presence calm and grounded. She didn't seek recognition or praise. She simply carried herself with quiet confidence, letting her actions speak louder than any words. The man watched her go, feeling gratitude for the lesson she had taught him, and understanding that this was one of those rare experiences in life that could truly change a person. As he finally stepped out into the bustling streets of New York, the man felt different than when he had arrived at the airport hours before. He felt humbled, reflective, and more aware of how easily assumptions can mislead us. He had learned that true strength is calm, measured, and competent, that respect is earned quietly and consistently, and that humility is a lesson we all need. even if it comes from the most unexpected sources. He walked forward, carrying the lesson with him, aware that life would continue to test assumptions and challenge egos. But he now understood that judging someone by appearances alone could never reflect their true character, skill, or worth. The quiet, composed woman who had sat beside him commanded the flight and quietly taught him a lesson would remain in his mind as a reminder, a symbol of humility, competence, and the power of quiet strength. And in that moment, he knew he would never look at anyone the same way again.